In a luxury boardroom overlooking London's financial district, a woman in an elegant charcoal business suit sat across from 8 corporate executives whose faces had gone pale with shock. The mahogany table between them was covered with acquisition papers, and the woman's pen moved with steady, deliberate strokes across each signature line. The CEO's hands trembled as he leaned forward, his voice breaking with desperation. "Mrs. Adelik, please reconsider. This airline has been in our family for 3 generations." The woman didn't look up from the documents. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, and colder than the air conditioning in that expensive room. "So has treating people with dignity. Your flight attendant broke my daughter's glasses. But more importantly, she tried to break her spirit." She signed the final page and slid the documents across the table. In that moment, with a few strokes of ink, she had just purchased an entire airline. But to understand how we got here, to understand why a billionaire tech mogul would spend hundreds of millions of dollars in what seemed like an act of revenge, we need to go back. Back to 6 hours earlier. Back to when none of them knew who she was. Back to a little girl with broken glasses and a mother who was about to teach the world a lesson about power, dignity, and what happens when you underestimate the quiet ones. Welcome to Living Black Stories. Here we share powerful and inspiring tales of resilience, strength, and triumph. If you love stories that empowers and motivates you, please join us. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notifications bell, and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Her name was Amara Adelik, and she was 10 years old. If you looked at Amara, you might not immediately recognize her as the daughter of one of Africa's wealthiest entrepreneurs. She was small for her age, the kind of child who seemed younger than she actually was. Her natural hair was styled in neat cornrows with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved her head. She wore a simple yellow sundress and white sneakers that had seen better days because she actually played in them, actually lived in them, the way children should. But the most notable thing about Amara were her glasses. Thick prescription lenses that magnified her warm brown eyes, making them seem impossibly large and curious. She'd worn glasses since she was 4 years old, diagnosed with severe myopia that made everything beyond a foot from her face dissolve into an impressionist painting of blurred shapes and colors. Those glasses weren't just a medical necessity. They were her security blanket, her constant companion, her way of seeing a world that she found endlessly fascinating. And they were custom-made, not because her mother wanted to show off wealth, but because etched into the inside of the left temple, invisible to everyone but Amara, was a quote from her late grandmother: "See the world clearly but look beyond what others see." Amara's grandmother had died when she was 7, but those words had stayed with her, a reminder that sight was about more than just vision. It was about perception. Understanding. Looking past the surface to the truth underneath. In her small hands as she walked through London's Heathrow Airport that November morning, Amara carried a thick astronomy book. Not a children's book with cartoon planets and simple facts. This was a real textbook, the kind university students struggled through, filled with equations and theories about stellar formation and the death of stars. Because Amara Adelik, at 10 years old, wanted to be an astrophysicist. She wanted to understand the universe. She wanted to map the cosmos. She wanted to see things that most people would never even think to look for. She was brilliant in that quiet, almost invisible way that shy children often are. The kind of brilliant that teachers sometimes miss because she didn't raise her hand or demand attention. She just absorbed everything, processed it, tucked it away in her remarkable mind for later use. Walking beside her through the airport was her mother, Falisaid Adelik. And if you passed them in the terminal, you probably wouldn't give them a second glance. Falisaid was dressed in jeans and a simple navy blouse. No jewelry except for a plain watch and her wedding ring, which she still wore even though her husband had died 7 years ago in a car accident that had left both her and 3-year-old Amara devastated. Falisaid had built Adelik Global Technologies from the ground up after her husband's death. Started it in her grief, channeled her pain into innovation, created a tech empire that revolutionized mobile banking and financial services across Africa and beyond. Forbes estimated her net worth at $4.2 billion. She was one of the most powerful women in global technology. She'd been featured on the cover of Time magazine. She'd given TED Talks. She'd had dinner with presidents and prime ministers. But none of that was visible as she walked through Heathrow holding her daughter's hand. Because Falisaid Adelik had made a very deliberate choice about how to raise Amara. Despite their wealth, despite the security concerns, despite the staff and the bodyguards and the assistants, she wanted her daughter to have as normal a life as possible. She wanted Amara to understand that money was a tool, not an identity. That wealth was a responsibility, not a shield from the realities of the world. So when they traveled, Falasaid kept a low profile. Her bodyguard, Chitty, a gentle giant of a man who'd been with the family since Amara was born, sat several rows away. Her executive assistant, Ngozi, who managed her schedule and her empire, traveled in a different section entirely. To anyone who saw them, they looked like an ordinary mother and daughter taking an ordinary trip. They were flying from London to Lagos on Westbridge Atlantic Airways, a mid-sized luxury airline that catered to business travelers and wealthy passengers flying between Europe and West Africa. Falasaid had deliberately chosen business class instead of first class. Not because she couldn't afford first class, but because she wanted to teach Amara something important, that you didn't need the most expensive ticket to deserve respect. That dignity wasn't determined by how much you paid or where you sat. She had no idea that this particular flight would test that philosophy in ways she never imagined. At the gate, as they waited to board, a woman in a crisp airline uniform approached them with a warm smile. Petra Blackwell was a gate agent who'd worked for Westbridge for nearly 15 years. She was in her late 30s, efficient and professional, but also genuinely kind in a way that had become rare in an industry that often treated passengers like cattle being moved from one place to another. Petra noticed the astronomy book tucked under Amara's arm, and her smile widened. Studying the stars? That's wonderful. Amara looked up, surprised to be noticed, surprised to be spoken to like a real person rather than just a child taking up space. She was shy by nature, always had been, but something about Petra's genuine interest made her open up just a little. Did you know, Amara said softly, her voice gaining confidence as she talked about her favorite subject, that light from some stars takes millions of years to reach us? We're literally looking into the past when we look at the night sky. Some of those stars might not even exist anymore, but we're still seeing their light. Petra's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine fascination. I never thought of it that way. That's incredible. You know what? You're going to do amazing things someday. It was such a small interaction. Maybe 30 seconds of conversation. But it mattered to Amara because so few adults talked to her like she was a real person with real thoughts worth hearing. Most adults either ignored children entirely or spoke to them in that condescending sing-song voice that made every word feel like an insult to intelligence. Falasaid watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. This was exactly why she traveled the way she did. These moments of ordinary human kindness were what she wanted her daughter to experience. To understand that respect and dignity weren't about money or status. They were about how people treated each other. How they saw each other's humanity. The boarding call came over the loudspeaker, and they joined the line of passengers making their way down the jetway. Amara clutched her astronomy book in one hand and her mother's hand in the other. She was excited about the flight, excited about going home to Lagos, excited about the project she was working on for school about stellar evolution. She had no idea that in the next few hours she would learn a much harder lesson. A lesson about how the world treated people who looked like her. A lesson about assumptions and prejudice and cruelty that hid behind professional smiles and polite words. A lesson that would break her heart and her glasses and, ultimately, change everything. They stepped onto the plane, the business class cabin stretching before them with its cream-colored leather seats and soft lighting. Their seats were 3A and 3B, window and middle seat on the left side of the aircraft. Amara took the window seat because she loved watching the clouds, loved the moment when the plane broke through the cloud layer and suddenly everything was brilliant blue sky above and soft white cotton below. She carefully placed her astronomy book on her lap and adjusted her glasses, a habit she had whenever she was settling into a new place. Those glasses, with her grandmother's words etched inside where only she could see them, were her anchor. Her way of seeing clearly in a world that often felt overwhelming and confusing. Falasaid settled into the seat beside her, pulling out her tablet to catch up on some work emails. Around them, other passengers were boarding, stowing luggage, settling into their seats with the practiced efficiency of frequent travelers. And somewhere in the forward galley, a flight attendant named Vivian Ashford Price was doing her pre-flight inspection, preparing for a routine 6-hour flight to Lagos. She had no idea that this routine flight would end with her losing her job, her reputation, and everything she'd built over 22 years in the aviation industry. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Because right now, in this moment, Amara was just a 10-year-old girl excited about a flight home. A girl who loved stars and science and her mother and the grandmother she'd lost but still carried with her in words etched on glass. A girl who believed that the world was fundamentally good, that people were fundamentally kind, that if you were polite and smart and tried your best, you would be treated fairly. She was about to learn how wrong that belief could be. And her mother was about to show the world what happened when someone tried to teach her daughter that she didn't belong. Before we continue with what happened on that flight, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of how they looked, where they came from, or assumptions people made about them? And more importantly, did you speak up or did you stay silent? Think about it honestly, because this story is about to show us the cost of both speaking up and staying silent. Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you want to see how this 10-year-old girl's broken glasses led to the purchase of an entire airline, if you want to witness one of the most powerful displays of quiet strength you'll ever hear about, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about power, justice, and what it really means to stand up for someone you love. The plane was preparing for takeoff. Amara was looking out the window at the ground crew loading luggage. Falisade was reviewing a contract on her tablet. And in the galley, a flight attendant who prided herself on maintaining standards was about to make assumptions that would cost her everything. The door closed. The engine started. And Amara Adelik had no idea that her world was about to shatter along with the glasses that helped her see it clearly. The cabin door sealed shut with that final definitive thunk that meant there was no turning back now. And that's when she appeared. Vivian Ashford Price was 48 years old and looked like she'd stepped out of a vintage advertisement for luxury air travel. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a flawless chignon without a single strand out of place. Her uniform was pressed so sharply you could probably cut paper on the creases. Her makeup was impeccable, her shoes polished to a mirror shine, and she carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she'd been told once, probably as a child, that slouching was a sign of moral weakness. She'd been a flight attendant for 22 years. 22 years of serving champagne and warm towels and making sure every pillow was fluffed just so. She took enormous pride in her work, in maintaining what she called standards. She believed that business class should feel like business class, that luxury meant attention to detail, that passengers paid premium prices for premium service. But underneath that professional veneer, underneath those perfect smiles and polished manners, Vivian Ashford Price carried something else. Assumptions. Prejudices. The kind of deeply embedded biases that she would never admit to, not even to herself, because she genuinely believed she treated everyone equally. Walking nervously behind her was Keisha Morrison, a 24-year-old black British woman who joined Westbridge Atlantic Airways just 3 months ago. This was Keisha's first transatlantic flight working business class, and she was terrified. Terrified of making mistakes. Terrified of disappointing Vivian, who had a reputation among the crew as brilliant at her job but absolutely ruthless with anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards. Keisha had watched Vivian reduce grown men to stammering apologies over a wrinkled napkin. She'd seen her get junior flight attendants written up for infractions so minor they barely qualified as mistakes. And she desperately wanted Vivian's approval, wanted to prove she belonged in this cabin, wanted to be seen as professional and competent. So when Vivian began her pre-flight walkthrough, Keisha followed like a nervous shadow, watching, learning, trying to anticipate what Vivian would want before she had to ask for it. Vivian moved through the cabin with the critical eye of a general inspecting troops. She adjusted a pillow here, straightened a magazine there, made sure every seat pocket was perfectly organized. Her eyes swept over each passenger, cataloging them, assessing them, making mental notes about who would need extra attention and who would be low maintenance. And then she reached row 3. And she saw Amara and Falisade. Something changed in Vivian's face. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't a dramatic shift that everyone could see. But if you were watching closely, if you understood the language of microexpressions and subtle cues, you saw it. The slight tightening around her eyes. The way her lips pressed together just a fraction. The quick up and down assessment of their casual clothing, Amara's beaded cornrows, those thick glasses that magnified her young eyes. Vivian looked at them and made a calculation. A judgment. An assumption based on nothing but what she saw in front of her. She turned to Keisha, and her voice was just loud enough for the passengers in rows 2, 3, and 4 to hear clearly. Check their boarding passes. Business class upgrades have been getting out of hand lately. Keisha's eyes widened in panic. Miss Ashford Price, they're already seated. They've been through boarding. I said check them. Vivian's voice was sharp, brooking no argument. Keisha's face flushed with embarrassment and confusion, but she didn't dare refuse. She approached Falisade with an apologetic expression, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, ma'am, but could I please verify your boarding passes? Falisade looked up from her tablet. Her face was perfectly calm, but her eyes held something that Keisha would remember later. Not anger. Not indignation. Just a kind of tired recognition, as if she'd seen this play out 1,000 times before and knew exactly how it would go. Without a word, Falisade reached into her bag and pulled out 2 boarding passes. She handed them to Keisha with steady hands. Amara, sitting beside her mother, was less practiced at hiding her emotions. Her small face showed confusion, then hurt, then a desperate attempt to appear unbothered. She looked down at her astronomy book, pretending to read, but her hands were gripping the pages too tightly, wrinkling them. Keisha examined the boarding passes, her hands shaking slightly. Legitimate business class tickets. Paid in full. Seat assignments correct. Everything was completely in order. She turned to Vivian and whispered, "They're legitimate business class passengers." Vivian's jaw tightened. For just a moment, something flickered across her face that might have been embarrassment, might have been shame. But she didn't apologize. Didn't acknowledge her mistake. Didn't look at Falisade or Amara and say the words that might have changed everything. "I'm sorry. That was inappropriate of me." She just moved on to the next row, continuing her inspection as if nothing had happened. But everyone in those surrounding rows had heard. Had seen. The white couple in 2A and 2B exchanged uncomfortable glances. In 4C, a Pakistani businessman named Yusuf Rahman shook his head slowly, his frown deepening. Across the aisle, a Portuguese professor named Helena Costa whispered something to her husband in rapid Portuguese, her tone making it clear that whatever she was saying, it wasn't complimentary to Vivian. Amara kept her eyes fixed on her book, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was trying very hard not to cry. Falisade reached over and gently squeezed her daughter's hand. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The message was clear. "I see you. I'm here. You did nothing wrong." The plane began its taxi to the runway. The safety demonstration played on the screens. Anne Vivian returned to the galley to prepare for beverage service, already compartmentalizing what had just happened, already convincing herself that she'd just been doing her job, maintaining standards, making sure everything was in order. 45 minutes later, once they'd reached cruising altitude, the beverage service began. Vivian transformed into a completely different person for the passengers she deemed worthy of her attention. She glided through the cabin with a warm smile, her voice honeyed and attentive as she served drinks and snacks. To the white couple in 2A and 2B, she was absolutely charming. "Here's your champagne, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. And I've brought some warm mixed nuts. Is there anything else I can get for you? Perhaps a blanket? The cabin can get quite cool at altitude." She spent nearly 5 minutes with them, chatting about where they were traveling, whether they needed any special accommodations, making sure they felt valued and attended to. She was equally attentive to the other passengers she'd mentally categorized as belonging in her cabin. The businessman in 1C got his whiskey with a knowing smile. The elderly woman in 4A got her tea with an extra biscuit and a warm blanket tucked around her knees. And then she reached row 3. The warmth evaporated from her face like water on hot pavement. Her voice, which had been so friendly and engaged just seconds before, went flat and cold. "Beverages? Not, 'What can I get for you?' Not, 'Would you care for something to drink?' Just beverages?" As if she were checking items off a list rather than serving human beings. Amara looked up from her astronomy book. She was polite, always had been, raised by a mother who believed that courtesy and kindness cost nothing and should be extended to everyone regardless of how they treated you. "May I please have orange juice?" Vivian nodded curtly and disappeared into the galley. When she returned, every other business class passenger's drinks were served in proper glassware. Crystal glasses for wine and champagne. Heavy glass tumblers for spirits. Elegant glasses for juice and soft drinks. But Vivian set down a plastic cup in front of Amara. The kind of disposable cup you'd get in economy class. And she set it down roughly, carelessly, so that some of the juice sloshed over the rim and spilled onto Amara's tray table. She didn't apologize. Didn't offer a napkin. Just moved on to the next row. Amara stared at the plastic cup and the puddle of orange juice spreading across her tray table. For a moment she just sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Trying to understand why the other passengers had gotten nice glasses and she'd gotten plastic. Trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. Then, without saying anything, without complaining or pointing out the unfairness, she reached for a napkin and quietly wiped up the spilled juice. She took a small sip from the plastic cup, set it down carefully and returned to her book. But her hands were shaking slightly as she turned the pages. Falisade had watched the entire interaction. Every second of it. The warm service to other passengers. The cold dismissal of her daughter. The plastic cup when everyone else got glass. The careless spill. And she saw something else too. She saw her daughter trying so hard to be brave, trying so hard not to make a scene, trying so hard to convince herself that maybe she was imagining the difference in treatment. Falisade wanted to say something. Wanted to call Vivian back and demand to know why her daughter had received inferior service. But she also wanted to see how Amara would handle this. Wanted to give her daughter the chance to navigate this herself before stepping in. Because this, unfortunately, would not be the last time Amara faced this kind of treatment. And Falisade needed her daughter to develop the strength to handle it. But she was watching. Taking mental notes. Recording everything. In seat 4C, Yusuf Rahman had also witnessed the entire interaction. He leaned forward slightly, catching Falisade's eye, and gave her a subtle nod of understanding and solidarity. He'd seen it. He knew what had just happened. And his expression said clearly, "This isn't right." Helena Costa, the Portuguese professor sitting across the aisle, whispered to her husband again, this time in English. "That's disgraceful. That poor child." But neither of them said anything to Vivian. It was easier to sympathize quietly, to acknowledge the injustice privately, than to actually confront it. An hour into the flight, the meal service began. By now the pattern was well established. Vivian was warm and attentive with some passengers, cold and dismissive with others. And Amara and Falisade fell firmly into the second category. Vivian worked her way through the cabin with her cart, offering each passenger their choice of meals with a smile. "We have herb-crusted salmon with asparagus and new potatoes, or beef Wellington with seasonal vegetables. Which would you prefer?" She gave them options. Described the meals enticingly. Made recommendations based on what she thought they might enjoy. But when she reached Amara, her entire approach changed. "There's a children's meal. Chicken nuggets and chips." Not, "Would you like the children's meal?" Not, "We have several options available." Just a flat statement, as if Amara's choice had already been made for her. Amara looked up, surprised. She could see the other passengers had been given menus, had been offered choices. She spoke quietly, still trying to be polite despite everything. "May I see the menu, please?" Vivian's smile was tight, condescending. The adult meals might be too spicy for children. This time Falisade spoke. Her voice was still calm, still controlled, but there was steel underneath. "My daughter asked to see the menu." For a moment, Vivian considered refusing. You could see the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of whether she could get away with denying such a simple request. But there were too many witnesses now. Too many passengers paying attention. She reluctantly handed over the menu card, practically tossing it onto Amara's tray table. Amara studied it carefully, reading every option, taking her time. She was a thoughtful child, not impulsive. And she was also, though she wouldn't have articulated it this way, establishing her right to make her own choices. "I'd like the salmon, please. With no sauce on the side if possible." Vivian's eyebrows rose. Under her breath, but still audible to anyone paying attention, she muttered, "Quite particular, aren't we?" The words were meant to diminish. To make Amara feel like she was being difficult, demanding, unreasonable. To make her feel ashamed of having preferences. Amara's face flushed. But she didn't change her order. Didn't apologize. Just nodded and waited. When the meal came 20 minutes later, Vivian set it down with noticeably less care than she'd shown with other passengers' meals. And despite Amara's polite request, the salmon was swimming in sauce, completely covering the fish and vegetables. Amara looked at it for a long moment. She could have complained. Could have pointed out that she'd specifically asked for no sauce. Could have asked for it to be remade. But she was 10 years old and already exhausted from being treated like she didn't belong. So she just picked up her fork and began carefully eating around the sauce, trying to salvage what she could of the meal. Keisha, the young flight attendant, had been watching all of this with growing distress. She'd witnessed every slight, every microaggression, every moment of differential treatment. And she knew it was wrong. Knew that Vivian was treating this child and her mother differently than the other passengers for reasons that had nothing to do with their behavior or their ticket class. But Keisha was terrified of Vivian. Terrified of speaking up and being labeled as difficult, as not a team player, as someone who couldn't handle the job. So she stayed silent, and her silence felt like complicity, and that feeling would haunt her for a long time. The meal service ended. Trays were collected. The cabin lights were dimmed for the afternoon portion of the flight. Some passengers reclined their seats and dozed. Others watched movies or read or worked on laptops. Amara needed to use the restroom. She stood carefully, and as she always did before entering small spaces where she might accidentally knock them off, she removed her glasses. She placed them gently on her seat, making sure they were stable, and made her way down the aisle to the lavatory. This was her habit. Had been since she first started wearing glasses at age 4. She was terrified of dropping them, of breaking them, of losing her ability to see clearly. So whenever she used airplane bathrooms or tight spaces, she left them behind where they'd be safe. While Amara was gone, Vivian came through the cabin with her trash bag, collecting napkins and empty cups and all the detritus of meal service. She reached row 3 and saw the glasses sitting on Amara's seat. Those thick prescription lenses catching the overhead light. Those colorful beads from Amara's cornrows had left a small smudge on one lens. Vivian stopped. And loud enough for passengers in rows 2, 3, 4 and 5 to hear clearly, she said, "Some people have no consideration for others. Leaving their belongings scattered about." She reached down and picked up the glasses, not gently, not with the care you'd use for someone's medical device, but roughly, as if they were trash she was annoyed to have to deal with. Yusuf Rahman immediately spoke up from his seat. "Those belong to the young girl. She'll be right back." Vivian turned to him, her expression showing irritation at being questioned. "They shouldn't be left on the seat." Helena Costa joined in, her voice firm. "She's just a child using the loo. She took them off so they wouldn't fall." Vivian's face tightened with annoyance. She wasn't used to passengers challenging her, wasn't used to being questioned about how she managed her cabin. In her mind, she was the authority here. She was the one with 22 years of experience. She was the one who knew how things should be done. She placed the glasses on Amara's tray table, but not carefully. Not securely. Just set them down with barely concealed irritation and moved on. The glasses sat there precariously, near the edge of the tray table, unstable. A minute later, Falasaid returned from the back of the plane where she'd gone to speak briefly with Chitty about some security arrangements for when they landed in Lagos. She slid into her seat in 3A and immediately noticed her daughter's glasses sitting dangerously close to the edge of the tray table. Her mother's instinct kicked in instantly. She reached across to move them to a safer position, to protect the one thing that allowed her daughter to see the world clearly, the one thing that carried her late mother's words etched into the frame. And that's when Vivian reappeared at row 3. She saw Falasaid reaching for the glasses and something in her snapped. All the little challenges to her authority that day, all the passengers who'd questioned her judgment, all the quiet accusations in their looks and whispers, it all came to a head in that moment. Her hand shot out. And what happened next would change everything. What would you do if you saw someone treating a child this way, incident after incident, humiliation after humiliation? Would you speak up in the moment, or would you convince yourself it wasn't your business? Drop your honest answer in the comments, because what's about to happen will make you question whether silence is ever really neutral. And if you want to see how a pair of broken glasses leads to the purchase of an entire airline, if you want to witness what happens when a mother decides that enough is finally enough, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the next 10 minutes of this story will show you that sometimes the quietest people carry the most devastating power, and that underestimating someone based on how they look is a mistake you only make once. The plane hummed through the air at 37,000 feet. Amara was still in the bathroom, carefully washing her hands, unaware that her world was about to shatter. Falasaid was reaching for her daughter's glasses to move them somewhere safe. Anne Vivian Ashford Price, with 22 years of experience and zero understanding of what she was about to unleash, was moving toward row 3 with her trash bag and her assumptions and her complete certainty that she was in control of her cabin. She had no idea that in approximately 30 seconds she would destroy the one thing she'd spent 2 decades building, her career. Falasaid's fingers had just closed around her daughter's glasses when Vivian returned to row 3 with her trash bag slung over her shoulder. The flight attendant saw Falasaid holding the glasses, and in that split second she made yet another assumption. Another judgment. Another decision based on nothing but the biases she'd been carrying around all day, all year, probably all her life. Those don't belong to you. Put them back. Her voice was sharp, accusatory, as if she'd caught Falasaid stealing something rather than a mother simply protecting her child's belongings. Falasaid looked up at her, and when she spoke, her voice was still calm, still controlled. But there was something underneath now, something that anyone paying attention would have recognized as a warning. "These are my daughter's glasses. I'm moving them somewhere safe." Vivian's face flushed. "I placed them on the table. They were fine where they were. They were about to fall. I'm her mother." And that's when Vivian made the mistake that would cost her everything. Her voice rose, loud enough that passengers several rows away could hear every word. "I've been doing this job for 22 years. I don't need passengers telling me how to manage my cabin. 22 years. She said it like it was a shield, like it gave her authority, like it meant she couldn't possibly be wrong. But what Vivian didn't understand in that moment was that experience without wisdom is just repetition. You can do something wrong for 22 years and it's still wrong. Falasade didn't argue. Didn't escalate. She simply set the glasses back down on the tray table, carefully making sure they were stable. And she waited. That's when Amara returned from the bathroom. The little girl sensed immediately that something was wrong. The air in the cabin felt different, charged with tension. Her mother's face was calm but her eyes were alert in that way that meant trouble. And Vivian was standing right there at their row, practically vibrating with indignation. Amara looked between them, confused, scared, not understanding what had happened in the 60 seconds she'd been gone. Vivian turned to her, and her voice was pointed, deliberately loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Your mother seems to think I don't know how to do my job. Amara's eyes went wide. I just needed to use the bathroom. Next time, take your belongings with you. This is business class, not a playground. The words hit Amara like a slap. This is business class, not a playground. The implication was clear. You don't belong here. You're just a child playing pretend in a space reserved for adults. For important people. For people who aren't you. And then Vivian did something that would replay in security footage, in witness statements, in legal depositions for months to come. She reached across, intending to demonstrate the proper placement of the glasses, to show this woman and her daughter that she, Vivian Ashford Price, knew better than they did about where things should go in her cabin. Her hand swept across the tray table with more force than she probably intended. And the glasses, those precious glasses with the strong prescription lenses and the late grandmother's words etched inside, went flying. They seemed to fall in slow motion, tumbling through the air, catching the overhead light, and then hitting the floor with a sound that made everyone in the surrounding rows freeze. The crack of breaking glass echoed through the business class cabin like a gunshot. Time stopped. Amara gasped, a small broken sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She dropped to her knees in the aisle, her hands reaching for the glasses with trembling fingers. When she picked them up, both lenses were destroyed. Spiderweb cracks radiated out from multiple impact points, making it impossible to see through them clearly. One of the temple pieces was bent at an unnatural angle. And worst of all, on the inside of that bent temple, where her grandmother's words had been carefully etched, there was now a crack running right through the middle of the quote. See the world clearly but look beyond what others see. The words were broken, just like the lenses, just like Amara's composure. Her eyes filled with tears. Not just about the glasses, though that would have been reason enough. But about everything. About the plastic cup. About the meal service. About the constant small humiliations throughout the flight. About being made to feel like she didn't belong, like she was an intruder in a space where she had every right to be. About being 10 years old and learning in the cruelest possible way that the world would judge her not by who she was but by what people assumed when they looked at her. The tears spilled down her cheeks as she tried desperately to see through the cracked lenses, as if by sheer force of will she could make them whole again. Vivian stood there for a moment, and you could see the calculation happening in her face. She knew she'd messed up. Knew this looked bad. But instead of taking responsibility, instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a shred of empathy for the crying child at her feet, she defaulted to defensiveness. Well, perhaps if they hadn't been left lying about. Falasade's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. Still calm. Still controlled. But with steel underneath that made it clear something fundamental had just shifted. You just destroyed my daughter's prescription glasses. It was an accident. These things happen. After you've spent this entire flight treating her with contempt. After making assumptions about who we are and whether we belong here. Vivian's face flushed red. I've done no such thing. I treat all passengers equally. And that's when the other passengers who had been watching this entire nightmare unfold, who had witnessed every slight and every microaggression throughout the flight, finally found their voices. Yusuf Rahman stood up from seat 4C, his considerable height making him an imposing figure. That's not true. I've watched you all flight. The plastic cup when everyone else got glassware. The meal service where you tried to force her into the children's meal. The comments loud enough for everyone to hear. I saw everything. Helena Costa leaned forward from across the aisle, her professorial voice carrying authority. I saw it too. This little girl has been nothing but polite, absolutely nothing but respectful, and you've been dreadful to her from the moment you saw her. Other passengers began murmuring agreement. A man in row 5 nodded vigorously. A woman in row 2 whispered to her husband, "She's right. I noticed it too." Vivian looked around at the sea of accusing faces, and you could see her starting to panic. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. She was the authority figure here. She was the one with the uniform and the experience and the power. How had this turned against her? I don't have to listen to this. Her voice was shrill now, defensive. If you have a complaint, you can file it after the flight. And she turned on her heel and walked back to the galley, leaving Amara still kneeling in the aisle, holding her broken glasses, crying softly. Falisade immediately knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close. Baby, I'm so sorry. Amara's voice was breaking, the words coming out between sobs. Grandma's words, they're on the glasses. See the world clearly but look beyond what others see. But now I can't see clearly at all. Everything's blurry and the words are broken and I can't. She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't articulate that it wasn't just about vision. It was about losing that connection to her grandmother. It was about the symbolism of those words being shattered right when she needed them most. It was about feeling like even the things that helped her see the world were being taken away from her. We'll get them fixed the moment we land. I promise. But Amara wasn't really hearing her mother's reassurances. She was lost in her confusion and hurt, asking the question that children ask when they first encounter real prejudice, the question that breaks parents' hearts because there's no good answer. Why was she so mean to me, Mama? What did I do wrong? Falisade felt something crack inside her chest. Because how do you explain to a 10-year-old that she did nothing wrong? That the cruelty she experienced had nothing to do with her behavior or her worth or anything she could have controlled? That sometimes people would hate her for no reason other than the color of her skin, the texture of her hair, the assumptions they made when they looked at her? You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all. Keisha, the young flight attendant who had been forced to participate in Vivian's discrimination, who had watched it all unfold with growing horror, finally found the courage to approach. She came over hesitantly, carrying a first aid kit as if that could somehow fix what had been broken here. I'm so sorry about your glasses. Is there anything I can bring you? Water? Anything at all? Amara looked up at her with red, swollen eyes and said the most heartbreaking thing. I just want to see. Keisha glanced back at the galley where Vivian stood with her arms crossed, deliberately not looking at row 3, talking to another flight attendant about something completely unrelated as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just destroyed a child's medical device and her sense of safety in one careless motion. That's when Dr. Miranda Webb, a 60-something British ophthalmologist sitting in 5A, leaned forward. She'd been watching everything with the clinical assessment of someone who understood exactly how serious this was. I'm a doctor. May I see the glasses? Amara handed them over with shaking hands. Dr. Webb examined them carefully, turning them over, looking at the damage from multiple angles, and her face grew increasingly grim. These are very strong prescription. Severe myopia, I'd guess. Without them, you can't see much at all, can you, sweetheart? Amara shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Dr. Webb turned to Falisade, and her voice was gentle but serious. I have a repair kit in my bag. I can't fix the lenses obviously, but I might be able to stabilize the frame and tape over the worst of the cracks so she can at least see somewhat. It won't be good, but it'll be better than nothing until you can get them properly replaced. Please, Falisade said. Anything you can do. For the next 10 minutes, Dr. Webb worked with the patience and precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with delicate instruments. She used tiny screwdrivers and wire and medical tape, carefully stabilizing the bent temple, taping over some of the worst cracks in the lenses to at least give Amara some ability to see. Other passengers watched in sympathy. Some were crying. Others were taking photos and videos, documenting what was happening. And in the galley, Vivian observed it all with crossed arms, and loud enough for the flight attendants around her to hear, she said, "People are so dramatic these days." Those words. That dismissal. That complete inability to take responsibility or show empathy. They would come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The plane began its descent into Lagos. The pilot's voice came over the intercom with the usual announcements about local time and weather and thanking passengers for flying Westbridge Atlantic Airways. But in row 3, Amara sat with her poorly repaired glasses perched on her nose, trying to see through the cracks in the tape and failing. The world was a blur. Just shapes and colors without definition. She couldn't read. Couldn't see faces clearly. Couldn't make out the details that had always brought her so much joy. The stars she loved to study were going to be impossible to see now. The astronomy book in her lap was just a collection of meaningless dark blurs on lighter blurs. She felt helpless. Vulnerable. Small in a way that had nothing to do with her physical size. The plane touched down. The cabin lights came up. Passengers began gathering their belongings, pulling bags from overhead compartments, preparing to deplane. Palisade helped Amara with her things, guiding her daughter since her vision was so compromised. As they waited in the aisle for their turn to exit, Yusuf Rahman approached them. "I took photos and video of some of what happened," he said, handing Palisade his business card. "If you need witnesses, if you pursue any kind of complaint or legal action, I'm happy to make a statement." What that woman did was unconscionable. Helena Costa was right behind him. "And I'll do the same. I teach ethics at the University of Lisbon. I know discrimination when I see it. That woman should not be working with people." Dr. Webb joined them, pressing her own card into Palisade's hand. "I documented the condition of the glasses, both before and after my repair attempt. Medical opinion if you need it. And honestly, as a physician, I'm appalled at the lack of care shown for a child's medical device." Palisade took their information, thanking each of them with genuine gratitude. These strangers, these witnesses, had found their courage a little too late to prevent what happened, but at least they were standing up now. And then, as they shuffled slowly toward the exit, as the passengers in front of them grabbed their bags and made their way off the plane, Palisade pulled out her phone and made a call. Her voice was quiet, but in the confined space of the aircraft, those nearby could hear every word. And what they heard made them stop and stare. "Tobias, it's Palisade. I need you to pull together everything we have on Westbridge Atlantic Airways." Pause. "Yes, the airline I'm currently on." Another pause. "I want ownership structure, board composition, stock distribution, debt obligations, everything. And I want it in 2 hours." The passengers near her exchanged glances. "Who was this woman?" "And contact our legal team. I want to know their protocols for passenger complaints and how many discrimination cases they've settled in the last 5 years." A longer pause. Someone on the other end was clearly asking questions. "Because I'm considering buying them. And if I do, things are going to change significantly." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The passengers who'd overheard were staring openly now. Buying them? Buying the airline? They deplaned in silence, but that silence was charged with anticipation. Something was about to happen. Something big. In the terminal, airport services had already been notified that there was an incident on the flight. A supervisor had been dispatched to meet them. Jeffrey Morrison was 55 years old, white British, and visibly nervous as he approached the woman and child who were at the center of whatever complaint had been filed. "Mrs.?" he began uncertainly. "Adelique. Palisade Adelique." The name meant nothing to him. "Not yet. Ms. Adelique, we've been informed there was an incident on your flight. We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Where is Vivian Ashford Price?" Jeffrey blinked, thrown by the directness of the question. "The flight attendant is currently in our crew area. Company policy is that we conduct an internal investigation first before. I want her here. Now." There was something in Palisade's tone that made Jeffrey immediately reach for his radio. He didn't understand why yet, but some instinct told him that this was not a woman to argue with. "Ms. Ashford Price, please report to Terminal C arrivals. We have a passenger situation that requires your presence." While they waited, Chidi and Ngozi joined them, having deplaned from their seats in economy. Ngozi took one look at Amara's tear-stained face and the broken glasses held together with tape and wire, and her face crumpled with concern. "What happened?" Amara's voice was small and exhausted. "I just want to go home." 5 minutes later, Vivian appeared. She was still in her uniform, still perfectly groomed, and she was accompanied by a union representative, a stern-looking man in his 40s who had clearly been briefing her on what to say and what not to say. Vivian had been coached. You could see it in the way she approached, in the practiced expression on her face, in the carefully chosen words. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding during the flight." "Misunderstanding?" Palisade's voice was sharp now, the calm finally giving way to controlled anger. "You spent an entire flight treating my daughter as if she didn't belong in business class. You gave her plastic cups while others got glassware. You questioned her meal choices. You made comments loud enough for other passengers to hear. And then you destroyed her prescription glasses and walked away." Vivian's union representative put a hand on her arm, a warning to be careful. "The glasses were an accident. Ms. Ashford Price has already offered to file an insurance claim. My daughter is 10 years old. She has severe myopia." Those glasses had her late grandmother's words etched inside them. They weren't just glasses. They were a connection to family she's lost. And your employee destroyed them while treating my daughter with contempt for 6 straight hours. Vivian, still defensive despite everything, "I understand you're upset, but accidents happen in close quarters. I've been flying for 22 years and... Did you treat the other passengers this way? The white couple in 2A and 2B? Did you give them plastic cups? Did you question their meal choices? Did you make comments about whether they belonged in business class? Vivian's face went pale. I treat all passengers professionally. Falassade pulled out her phone, scrolling to the contact information she'd collected. I have 3 witnesses who disagree. One took video. Would you like to see it? The color drained from Vivian's face completely now. Jeffrey tried to step in, to mediate, to salvage what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. Ms. Adelik, we take these matters very seriously. We'll be conducting a full investigation, and appropriate action will be. What's the name of your CEO? Jeffrey blinked at the sudden change of topic. Richard Pemberton. But I don't see how. And your parent company? Westbridge Holdings, based in London. But owned by the Pemberton Family Trust. Richard Pemberton owns 60% of the shares. The remaining 40% is split between various institutional investors. Jeffrey stared at her. Yes, that's correct. But how did you? Because for the last hour, while your flight attendant has been receiving coaching from her union representative, my team has been analyzing your company's financial structure, stock distribution, and debt obligations. She pulled out her tablet, turning it so Jeffrey could see the screen filled with financial data, stock charts, ownership structures. Westbridge Atlantic Airways has been struggling since the pandemic. Your stock price is down 40% over the last 2 years. You're carrying significant debt. And several of your major investors have been quietly trying to sell their positions because they don't believe your current management can turn things around. Jeffrey and Vivian were both staring now, trying to understand what was happening, trying to process where this was going. Falassade looked at them both, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly calm again. Calm in the way that a judge is calm when pronouncing sentence. My name is Falassade Adelik. I founded Adelik Global Technologies. Perhaps you've heard of it? Jeffrey's face drained of all color. He had heard of it. Everyone in the business world had heard of it. Adelik Global Technologies was one of the most successful tech companies to come out of Africa in the last decade. And Falassade Adelik was... I'm worth $4.2 billion, Falassade said quietly. And I'm about to make some calls. The terminal seemed to go silent around them. Other passengers who'd been on the flight and had witnessed what happened were watching this unfold with something like awe. Vivian looked like she might be sick. Her union representative had gone completely pale. And Jeffrey was already mentally composing the email he was going to have to send to Richard Pemberton in about 30 seconds. Falassade looked down at her daughter, at Amara with her broken glasses and tear-stained face, and something hardened in her expression. You broke my daughter's glasses. But more importantly, you tried to break her spirit. You tried to make her feel like she didn't belong. Like she was less than. Like the color of her skin determined her worth. She looked back up at Vivian. That was your mistake. Because I have the resources to make sure you never do this to another child again. And I'm going to use every single one of them. Falassade turned to Jeffrey. I suggest you call your CEO. Tell him that Falassade Adelik is about to become his new majority shareholder. And when I am, the first order of business will be addressing the culture that allowed this to happen. She took Amara's hand and walked away, Chitty and Ngozi flanking them protectively. Behind them, Jeffrey was already frantically dialing his phone. Vivian stood frozen, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd done. And the other passengers from the flight were already pulling out their own phones, texting, calling, posting on social media, spreading the story of what they just witnessed. Within an hour it would be trending on Twitter. Within 3 hours news outlets would be picking it up. Within 6 hours, Falassade Adelik would be signing papers that gave her controlling interest in Westbridge Atlantic Airways. And Vivian Ashford Price's 22-year career would be over. But we're not done yet. Because the story of how a pair of broken glasses led to the complete restructuring of an airline, how a mother's love became a lesson in corporate accountability, how a 10-year-old girl's tears changed an entire industry, that story is just beginning. What would you do if you had the power to change a system that hurt you or someone you loved? Would you use it? And more importantly, how would you use it? Would you seek revenge or would you seek reform? Drop your thoughts in the comments because what happens next will show you that real power isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about making sure they can't hurt anyone else. And if you want to see the moment when Richard Pemberton realizes his family's airline is about to be owned by the woman whose daughter his employee discriminated against, if you want to witness what real accountability looks like, subscribe to this channel right now. Because the next part of this story takes us into a boardroom where a billionaire is about to teach an entire industry what happens when you confuse quiet dignity with weakness. The phone calls were being made. The lawyers were being mobilized. The stock purchases were being executed. And somewhere in London, Richard Pemberton was about to receive the worst news of his professional life. All because a flight attendant thought a 10-year-old girl in a yellow sundress with beaded cornrows and thick glasses didn't belong in business class. All because someone forgot that dignity isn't determined by wealth or status. It's determined by how we treat each other, especially when we think no one powerful is watching. Vivian Ashford Price had just learned the hardest lesson of her life. Everyone is powerful in someone's eyes. Everyone belongs somewhere. And the little girl you dismissed today might just be the daughter of the woman who buys your entire company tomorrow. 4 hours after that confrontation in the Lagos airport terminal, in a stunning modern mansion in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, Amara Adelik sat in her bedroom with a pair of temporary glasses perched on her nose. They weren't her glasses. They were borrowed from an optometrist who'd opened his practice on emergency call from Falassade, who'd paid him triple his usual fee to come to their home immediately and fit Amara with something, anything, so she could see clearly again. These temporary glasses worked technically. They corrected her vision. But they felt wrong on her face. Too loose. Too light. They weren't hers. On her desk, carefully placed on a velvet cloth like a museum artifact, sat her broken glasses. The ones with the spiderweb cracks through both lenses. The ones with the bent temple piece. The ones with her grandmother's words etched inside, now split by a crack that ran right through the middle of the quote. Amara reached out and traced her finger over the broken lenses, feeling the ridges where the cracks had splintered the glass. She couldn't read the words anymore, not through all the damage. But she knew them by heart. Had known them since she was 7 years old, and her grandmother had presented her with these custom-made glasses, explaining that seeing clearly was about more than just vision. See the world clearly but look beyond what others see. Amara had spent the last 4 hours trying to understand what that meant now. Trying to figure out what she was supposed to see beyond Vivian's cruelty. Trying to look past the humiliation and the hurt and the broken glass to something deeper. But she was 10 years old, and all she could see was that the world wasn't as kind as she'd believed it to be. Downstairs in her home office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lagos's glittering skyline, Falassade was on her third video call of the evening. Her face was illuminated by the blue glow of multiple screens, each showing different data, different people, different pieces of the puzzle she was rapidly assembling. On the main screen was Tobias Okonkwo, her chief financial officer. He was a brilliant man who'd been with Adelik Global Technologies since the beginning, who'd helped Falassade build her empire from a single innovative idea into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And right now he was telling her exactly what she wanted to hear. 3 of the major shareholders are willing to sell immediately. They've been looking for an exit strategy for months. The airline's been struggling, and they don't have confidence in current management's ability to turn things around. When they heard that Falassade Adelik was interested in buying, they practically jumped at the chance. Falassade's second call was with her legal team, 3 of the sharpest attorneys in international corporate law. They'd been digging through Westbridge Atlantic Airways' legal history, and what they'd found was damning. Westbridge has settled 4 discrimination cases in the past 3 years. All with non-disclosure agreements, so the details never became public. But we can access them through discovery if needed. The pattern is clear. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic problem they've been paying to keep quiet. Her third call was with her head of corporate strategy, a woman who specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. Richard Pemberton is panicking. He's been making calls all evening, trying to shore up support, trying to convince his investors to hold their positions. But he knows the math. If we buy out the other shareholders, we can force him out or make him sell his majority stake at a significantly depressed value. He's cornered. Falassade listened to all of this with the calm focus of someone who'd built an empire by knowing exactly when to strike and how hard. I want a meeting tomorrow. London. With Pemberton and his entire board. Tobias's face on the screen showed concern. Falassade, are you sure about this? We're talking about a significant investment just to make a point. Westbridge Atlantic Airways isn't a strategic fit for Adelik Global Technologies. The sectors don't align. The synergies aren't there. This is purely about. It's not about making a point. Falassade's voice was quiet but firm. It's about making sure no other child is treated the way my daughter was treated today. And it's about showing Amara that when people try to make you feel small, you don't shrink. You rise. She ended the calls and sat back in her chair, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there were thousands of other children who'd been treated the way Amara had been treated. Who'd been made to feel like they didn't belong. Who'd been judged and dismissed and humiliated based on nothing but how they looked. And most of them didn't have a mother with $4 billion and the will to use it. But Amara did. Anne Palisade was about to make sure that her daughter's pain became the catalyst for change that would protect all those other children. The next day, in a luxurious boardroom in London overlooking the city's financial district, 8 people sat around a mahogany table that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. The walls were decorated with expensive art. The chairs were Italian leather. Everything about the room screamed old money, established power, generational wealth. Richard Pemberton sat at the head of the table, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. He was in his 60s, the kind of white British man who'd inherited his position rather than earned it, who'd grown up believing that the family airline would always be the family airline, that some things were simply permanent and unchangeable. Sitting around him were his board members, 7 white men and 1 white woman, all from the same social class, all from the same educational background, all looking at each other with barely concealed panic. Also present were the company's lawyers, their HR director who'd spent the last 12 hours frantically reviewing every policy and procedure, and notably, sitting in the corner looking like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper, Vivian Ashford Price. They'd told her she had to be there. The union representative beside her kept whispering instructions, but Vivian wasn't really hearing them. She was too busy replaying every moment of that flight, every assumption she'd made, every cruel word she'd spoken, and trying to understand how it had led to this. The door opened. Palisade Adelique walked in, and she was transformed from the casually dressed woman who'd boarded that flight yesterday. Now she was in full power mode, a designer suit in deep navy that probably cost more than Vivian's monthly salary, heels that added 3 inches to her height, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo, diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement. She moved with the confident stride of someone who owned rooms before she even entered them. Behind her came her legal team, carrying briefcases and tablets, looking like an invading army of corporate warriors. Richard Pemberton stood, trying to salvage some control over the situation. "Mrs. Adelique, I want to begin by offering our sincerest." "Save it." Palisade's voice cut through the room like a knife. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because as of 1 hour ago, I own 51% of this airline." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on that expensive carpet. Richard's face went white. That's impossible. My family has controlled Westbridge for 3 generations. We have protections in place, shareholder agreements. Palisade's lawyer, a woman who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals across 3 continents, slid a stack of documents across that mahogany table. Your investors were eager to sell. Mrs. Adelique paid above market value. She now has controlling interest. Everything is legal, documented, and irreversible. As of 9 o'clock this morning London time, Palisade Adelique is the majority shareholder of Westbridge Atlantic Airways. Richard slumped back in his chair as if someone had cut his strings. The board members were staring at the documents, then at each other, then at Palisade, trying to process how their entire world had just been upended in less than 24 hours. Palisade remained standing. She wanted them to understand the power dynamic here, wanted them to be very clear about who was in charge now. "Let me be clear about why I'm here. Yesterday, my 10-year-old daughter was discriminated against by your flight attendant. She was treated as if she didn't belong in business class. She was given inferior service. She was humiliated repeatedly throughout a 6-hour flight. And then her prescription glasses, which contained words from her late grandmother, were destroyed. And when I raised concerns about all of this, your staff was more interested in protecting your employee than protecting my child." Vivian, her voice shaking so badly she could barely get the words out, spoke up from her corner. "Mrs. Adelique, I swear I didn't know who you were. If I had known." And that's exactly the problem. Palisade turned to look directly at her, and Vivian felt pinned by that gaze like a butterfly on a board. "You should treat every passenger with dignity regardless of who they are. My daughter could have been anyone's child. She could have been a girl from a working-class family who saved for months to afford that ticket. She could have been someone without resources or power or a mother who could fight back. Would that have made your behavior more acceptable?" Vivian's eyes filled with tears. No. No, it wouldn't. I have 3 witnesses who documented everything that happened. I have video evidence. I have medical documentation of the damage to my daughter's glasses. I could sue you personally. I could sue this airline. I could make this the biggest discrimination story of the year. I could destroy your reputation so thoroughly that you'd never work in hospitality again. Vivian was openly crying now, mascara running down her face, her perfect uniform suddenly looking rumpled and sad. But I'm not going to do that. Palisade's voice softened slightly, not with forgiveness but with purpose. Instead, I'm going to fix the culture that allowed this to happen. She walked to the windows overlooking the airport, watching planes take off and land, carrying thousands of passengers who trusted that they would be treated with respect regardless of who they were. Effective immediately, I'm implementing the following changes. The board members scrambled for pens and paper, suddenly realizing they needed to document every word. First, mandatory bias training for every employee. And I don't mean token training. Not a 2-hour seminar where everyone nods along and nothing changes. I mean real, intensive work with consequences for those who don't take it seriously. We're bringing in experts. We're having difficult conversations. We're addressing the implicit biases that led to my daughter being treated the way she was. She turned back to face them. Second, we're establishing an independent passenger advocacy office. A direct line for passengers to report discrimination, investigated by a third party, not internal HR. Because clearly your internal processes have been failing people for years. The board members were writing furiously now. Third, we're diversifying your leadership. This board is 7 white men and 1 white woman. That changes now. I want to see what the actual world looks like, not just what your country club looks like. I want perspectives from people who understand what it's like to be judged, dismissed, and underestimated. Because those are the people who'll make sure this never happens again. Richard found his voice, though it came out weak and defensive. Mrs. Adelik, some of these board members have been with this company for decades. They have institutional knowledge, relationships. Then they've had decades to fix this problem and chose not to. Their time is done. She walked back to the table and looked directly at Vivian, who shrank back in her chair. As for you, Ms. Ashford Price, you're terminated. Effective immediately. Vivian's face crumpled. Please. I've worked here for 22 years. I have a mortgage. I have responsibilities. I have. Then you should have thought about that before you mistreated a child. Palisade's voice was hard now, uncompromising. However, I'm not heartless. You'll receive 6 months of severance. That's more than generous considering what you did. Use that time to examine why you treated my daughter the way you did. Use it to confront your own biases. Use it to become better. Vivian was broken now, sobbing into her hands. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Palisade looked at her for a long moment. Tell that to my daughter. She gathered her materials, signaled to her legal team that they were done. Gentleman and lady, she nodded to the lone woman on the board, I'll be reviewing operations over the next month. Expect significant changes. Expect accountability. And expect that this airline will never again be a place where people are judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Richard? You'll be receiving my recommendations for new board members by the end of the week. You can accept them or you can sell me your remaining shares and walk away. Your choice. The door closed behind her, and in the boardroom, 8 people sat in stunned silence, trying to process how their entire world had just been reconstructed around them. 1 month later, on the same London to Lagos route, everything had changed. The plane itself looked different. The crew was visibly more diverse. Flight attendants wore new badges indicating they'd completed intensive bias training. The atmosphere felt different too, warmer somehow, more welcoming. Keisha Morrison, the young flight attendant who'd been forced to participate in Vivian's discrimination, who'd witnessed everything with growing horror but had been too afraid to speak up, was now the lead attendant on this flight. She greeted passengers at the door with genuine warmth, with confidence she'd never shown when Vivian had been supervising her. A diverse group of passengers boarded. Families of different backgrounds. Business travelers from various countries. People in suits and people in casual clothes, all treated with the same respect, the same attention, the same dignity. And among them, returning to Lagos after a brief trip to London, were Palisade and Amara. Amara now had new glasses. Perfect prescription lenses in a new frame. She could see clearly again. But she also carried something else, a small velvet-lined case containing her broken glasses. She decided to keep them, not as a reminder of pain but as a reminder of change. Of what had been broken and what had been rebuilt. Keisha saw them approaching and her eyes widened with recognition and something like gratitude. She approached carefully, respectfully. Ms. Amara. Ms. Adelik. Welcome aboard. Amara looked up at her and gave a shy smile. Hi, Keisha. I want you to know that what happened to you, it changed everything here. We've had intensive training. Real conversations. Difficult conversations about bias and assumptions and how we see people. And Ms. Adelik's changes are making a real difference. People feel safe here now. Safe to be themselves, safe to speak up when something's wrong. Falisaid smiled at her. How are you finding the lead position? Keisha laughed softly. Terrifying, honestly. But rewarding. I feel like I can actually be myself now. Like I can speak up when something's wrong instead of staying silent because I'm afraid of losing my job. Amara's voice was quiet but firm. That's good. Everyone should feel like they can speak up. They settled into their seats, business class again, but this time the service was warm and equal from the start. Beverages came in proper glassware. Meal choices were offered with genuine interest. And Amara, looking around at the diverse crew and the atmosphere of respect, felt something she hadn't felt on that last flight, like she belonged. Mid-flight, as the cabin lights dimmed and other passengers dozed or read or watched movies, Falisaid and Amara talked quietly. Mama, Amara said, her voice thoughtful. Did you really buy the whole airline just because of what happened to me? Falisaid considered the question carefully. I bought the airline because what happened to you was a symptom of something bigger. It wasn't just one mean flight attendant. It was a culture that allowed that behavior. A system that protected the wrong people and failed the vulnerable ones. And I had the power to change it. So I did. But it must have cost so much money. Money is just a tool, sweetheart. It's not the goal. It's not the point. The question isn't how much you have. The question is what you do with it. I could have sued them, taken their money in a settlement, and nothing fundamental would have changed. Or I could change the entire system. Make it so that what happened to you doesn't happen to the next child, or the one after that, or the thousands after that. Amara was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked something that surprised her mother. Do you think Ms. Vivian will be okay? Falisaid looked at her daughter with a mixture of surprise and pride. You're worried about her? After everything she did to you? I'm angry about what she did, Amara said carefully. I'm still hurt about my glasses, about how she made me feel. But I don't want her whole life ruined. I just want her to understand why it was wrong. I want her to be better. Falisaid pulled her daughter close, feeling tears prick her eyes. You have your grandmother's heart. She always believed people could change if given the chance. If they were willing to do the hard work. Is that why you gave her severance? Even though you didn't have to? Yes. Justice isn't about revenge, baby. It's not about destroying people who hurt us. It's about making things right and preventing them from happening again. I wanted Vivian to have the time and resources to actually change, not just to be angry and bitter and learn nothing. Amara nodded, understanding more than most 10-year-olds would. I hope she does change. I hope she helps other people not make the same mistakes. 3 months after the incident, back home in Lagos, a letter arrived addressed to Amara Adelik. She was in the living room doing homework when Falisaid brought it to her. The return address was from London, and the handwriting was neat, careful, as if whoever wrote it had taken great pains to get every letter perfect. Amara opened it, unfolding pages covered in that same careful handwriting. She began to read aloud to her mother. Dear Amara, I don't know if you'll read this. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away the moment you saw my name. But I needed to write it anyway because you deserve to know what's happened since that day on the plane. You deserve to know what you changed. I've spent the last 3 months in therapy. Twice a week, I sit in a room with a woman who asks me hard questions about where my beliefs came from, about the family I grew up in, about the messages I absorbed without even realizing I was absorbing them. My therapist helped me see that I was raised with certain beliefs I never questioned. That people who looked a certain way belonged in certain spaces, and people who looked different didn't. That I had a right to judge who deserved respect and who didn't. I felt threatened by change. Threatened by people who didn't look like the passengers I was used to serving. Threatened by the idea that the world I knew, the world I was comfortable in, was shifting in ways I couldn't control. So I tried to maintain what I thought of as standards. But what I was really doing was enforcing my own prejudices. Protecting my own comfort by making other people uncomfortable. I convinced myself I was just doing my job. That I was maintaining professionalism. That I treated everyone equally. But I didn't. I couldn't even see my own bias because it was so deeply embedded in how I viewed the world. I can't undo what I did to you. I can't give you back those glasses with your grandmother's words etched inside them. I can't take back the plastic cup or the forced march to the back of the plane or the way I made you feel like you didn't belong. I can't erase the hurt or the tears or the moment when your glasses shattered on the floor. But I want you to know that you changed my life. Losing my job was the best thing that could have happened to me because it forced me to confront who I'd become. It forced me to look in the mirror and see the ugliness I'd been carrying around, the prejudices I'd been nurturing, the harm I'd been causing. I'm now volunteering with an anti-racism education group. I go into companies and organizations and I tell my story. The whole ugly truth of what I did and why I did it and what it cost me and what it cost you. I share it because I believe that if people hear it from someone like me, someone who looks like them and comes from the same background they do, maybe they'll recognize their own biases before they cause the same harm. I'm working to be better. Not because I expect forgiveness. Not because I think I can somehow make up for what I did. But because you showed me something important. You showed me grace even when I didn't deserve it. You showed me that dignity isn't about fighting fire with fire. It's about being better than the people who hurt you. Thank you for being brave enough to be yourself, even when someone like me tried to make you feel like you didn't belong. You belong there, Amara. You belong everywhere. Never let anyone make you doubt that again. With deep regret and hope for redemption, Vivian Ashford Price. Amara finished reading and looked up at her mother with tears in her eyes. Do you think people can really change? Palisade was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think some people can, if they're willing to do the hard work. If they're willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. If they're willing to sit with their shame and their guilt and use it as fuel for growth instead of just wallowing in it. The question isn't just whether people can change. It's whether we're willing to let them. Whether we're willing to believe in their capacity for growth. Amara nodded slowly, then took the letter and went to her room. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out the velvet case containing her broken glasses. She set them on her desk next to her new ones and just looked at them for a long time. The new glasses were perfect. Clear lenses. Straight temples. They helped her see the stars she loved, helped her read her astronomy books, helped her navigate the world with clarity. But the broken ones taught her something different. They taught her about injustice and cruelty and the casual ways people could hurt each other. But they also taught her about power and change and the difference between revenge and justice. She held both pairs, looking through the new clear lenses at the old cracked ones, and in that moment she understood what her grandmother's words really meant. Years later, when Amara was grown, when she was studying astrophysics at MIT and spending her nights in observatories mapping distant galaxies, she would look back on that day and understand it differently than she had as a 10-year-old child. She would understand that her mother hadn't bought an airline just to punish one cruel woman. She'd bought it to change a system. To protect all the other children who would board planes in the years to come. To make sure that a yellow sundress and beaded cornrows and thick glasses wouldn't be reasons for someone to assume you didn't belong. And she would understand something even more important, that power isn't just about money or control. Real power is about creating change that lasts beyond a single moment. Her mother could have destroyed Vivian, could have destroyed the airline, could have made headlines and moved on to the next thing. Instead, she rebuilt something broken. She forced an entire industry to look at itself and confront its own biases. She turned her daughter's pain into protection for thousands of other children. I was 10 years old, adult Amara would say years later, speaking to young women interested in STEM fields and breaking barriers and using their power for good, when I learned what real strength looks like. It's not about crushing people who wrong you. It's not about revenge or destruction or making sure your enemies suffer. Real strength is about making sure they can't hurt anyone else. It's about changing systems, not just punishing individuals. It's about looking beyond the immediate hurt to the bigger picture of what needs to be different. My grandmother's words were etched in those broken glasses. See the world clearly, but look beyond what others see. I can't read them anymore through all the cracks. But I don't need to, because I finally understand what she meant. She meant that clarity isn't just about vision. It's about perception. Understanding. Looking past the surface to the deeper truths underneath. Seeing not just what is, but what could be. Not just who people are in their worst moments, but who they could become if given the chance and the challenge to be better. Today, under Palisade Adelik's ownership, Westbridge Atlantic Airways is the highest-rated airline for passenger satisfaction and diversity in Europe. They've had 0 discrimination complaints in the 3 years since the restructuring. Their staff represents the actual diversity of the world, not just one narrow slice of it. And their training programs have become the gold standard that other airlines are now copying. Amara Adelik is 18 now, studying astrophysics at MIT, mapping the cosmos and dreaming of discoveries that will expand human understanding of the universe. But she still keeps those broken glasses in a case on her desk, right next to her perfect new ones. A reminder of what was broken and what was rebuilt. Vivian Ashford Price runs a non-profit organization called Second Sight, dedicated to educating aviation professionals about implicit bias. She shares her story everywhere she goes, holding nothing back, using her shame as a teaching tool. She'll never undo what she did. But she's spending the rest of her life making sure other people don't make the same mistakes. Ann Keisha Morrison is now Director of Customer Experience for Westbridge Atlantic Airways, the youngest person ever to hold that position. She's the one who greets new flight attendants on their first day and tells them the story of Amara and the broken glasses. She tells them why respect isn't optional, why dignity isn't negotiable, why every passenger, regardless of what they look like or how they're dressed, deserves to be treated like they belong. Because they do belong. All of them. This story started with broken glasses and a crying child. But it ended with systemic change and the kind of justice that doesn't just punish, it transforms. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you had the power to change something that was fundamentally broken, something that hurt you or someone you loved, would you use that power for revenge or for reform? Would you destroy your enemies or would you rebuild the system that created them? Think about it honestly, because that choice defines who we are in our most powerful moments. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about power and justice and the difference between punishment and accountability, then subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this, stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, stories about pain transformed into purpose, these are the stories that matter. These are the stories that remind us what we're capable of when we choose to be better than the worst things that happen to us. A pair of broken glasses changed an industry. A mother's love transformed a corporation. And a 10-year-old girl's tears became the catalyst for protecting thousands of other children from the same pain. That's not just a story about an airline. It's a story about what happens when we refuse to accept that cruelty is just the way things are. When we use our power, whatever power we have, to make sure the next person doesn't suffer the same way we did. Amara's glasses are still broken. But the system that broke them has been rebuilt from the ground up. And that, more than any revenge, more than any lawsuit, more than any headline, is what real justice looks like. Thank you for watching this powerful story about Amara Falasade, and how a moment of cruelty became a catalyst for systemic change. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about power, justice, and the responsibility we all have to stand up against discrimination, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling me, have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had the power to change the entire system? Or maybe you've been in a position where you had to choose between revenge and reform. What did you choose and why? And here's the most important part. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, about pain transformed into purpose, about using power not to destroy but to rebuild, these are the stories we need to keep telling. These are the stories that remind us change is possible when we refuse to stay silent. Remember, Amara's broken glasses weren't just repaired. The entire system that broke them was rebuilt from the ground up. That's not just a story about one family or one airline. It's a blueprint for how we all can use whatever power we have, whatever platform we have, to make sure the next person doesn't suffer the same way we did. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of a community that believes in justice, dignity, and the power of speaking up. See you in the next video. Until then, remember Amara's grandmother's words, see the world clearly but look beyond what others see. Look beyond the surface. Look toward what could be. Look toward the change you want to create. Take care and keep fighting for a world where everyone belongs.